All right, welcome everyone. Today we are talking about trauma recovery and resilience within the LGBTQ plus community. So here is what to expect for today. So I'm going to be doing an overview on the LGBTQ Center OC and the Elevate program. For folks who have been here for a lot of these presentations, this is very repetitive, but we just want to make sure that for folks who have not come here yet, they are aware of all of our services. I will be reviewing definitions of trauma and types of trauma, the effects of complex trauma, the different types of trauma that LGBTQ plus folks experience, the effects of that trauma on the LGBTQ plus body, and coping and recovery from trauma. Of course, I'll provide some resources as well. So a little bit about the LGBTQ Center OC. Our mission is to advocate on behalf of County lesbian, bisexual,
Because I'm always
transgender.
hungry, Vaughn. I seriously need to eat like every hour.
Ruth,
So.
Ruth, do you mind muting yourself? No. For some reason I can't find it. Thank you. Appreciate it. You got unmuted again. Oh, there you go. Okay. Okay. So, oops, not that one I meant to do. The Orange County LGBTQ Center. So we provide a lot of different services. We have youth programs. We have a ton of different youth groups. They are social educational groups. We also have mental health groups and process groups. We have opportunities for youth to get involved in the community, to advocate for different types of services like restorative justice programs or just like educating in the community. So if you have any youth that you can think of that are looking for community or just wanting to do some kind of like advocacy, definitely recommend them coming to our youth programs. We did just start moving more towards hybrid programming, which means every other week we'll be holding our groups in person, which has been something that a lot of people have long awaited. So we're happy to say that we are starting to transition into that. We do a lot of community programs and events. We have an Indigo Ball coming up pretty soon in April, one of our biggest fundraising events. We do mental health and emotional wellness. We have a pretty comprehensive mental health program. We do it on a sliding scale. We don't accept insurance. We do individual, we do family, and we do couples therapy as well. And through the Elevate program, I'm able to offer mental health services as well. So that's something I'll jump into a little bit further. We have our trans health and wellness program. So this we include like, what's it called? Oh my God. Linkage to care, sorry. Linkage to care, so finding doctors who are LGBTQ affirming. We help with like legal clinics, so name change and gender marker change. We have a once a month trans orientation that really covers like the mental health aspects, but also like the legal aspects and like what to expect when you do get on like hormone replacement therapy and things like that. So it's a really great, I even recommend just joining the trans orientation just for your own information. We do it on a monthly basis. We have HIV prevention and awareness that we do for free. So we have a walk-in basis, but we also do appointments as well at our Spurgeon location. Immigration services are awesome. We do a lot of like DACA English classes. We have a family, like a Spanish group that meets as well. So we got a lot of different groups or resources for immigration services. We also are constantly doing advocacy and education in the community. And of course, we have volunteer opportunities. So for the Elevate Youth program, we have, so our goal for Elevate Youth is to reframe substance abuse as a public health issue. We want to combat the detrimental impacts from the war on drugs on BIPOC and LGBTQ plus youth and young adults. This is where I come in. So we provide trauma-informed counseling and process groups at no cost, which is pretty hard to find these days. I also don't have a wait list. So if you have anybody that you want to recommend, I'm so sorry. I knew she was going to make a debut. This is my Chihuahua. I had my spray bottle ready to spray her, but that's okay. Yeah, so I do a short-term 1 to 10 sessions, and then if needed, they can transition into our mental health program as well. And we also raise awareness through social media, campaigns, activities, events, and presentations like this. I'm gonna go ahead and jump in. So what is trauma? I should warn you all, this is a very dense presentation. Trauma is very dense. It's multifaceted. So hang with me tonight. Hopefully I can try and make this a little bit entertaining, but I promise you will leave with jam-packed with information. So what is trauma? So trauma is a highly complex, individualized, and personalized phenomenon that has been defined as an event or a series of events or situations that are shocking, terrifying, and or overwhelming that produce intense and overpowering feelings of fear and hopelessness. Everyone experiences trauma differently. So what might be traumatic and have prolonged effects on one person might be normal experiences in other families.
I want to see the slides.
Communities, etc. Ruth, I have you not muted again. Thank you. So with this, it's important to keep in mind that everybody's going to have a different threshold. So culturally, what might be traumatic to you might not be traumatic to somebody else. And you can even like test this with like your friends and things like that. So something that might affect you long-term is not going to affect somebody else. So just keep that in mind. So just to give like a brief overview, some of you have seen this slide already, but adverse childhood experiences is something that is used to kind of measure levels of trauma or like impacts of trauma. So you have the CDC and Kaiser partnered together. But the categories that they found are like child abuse, which includes sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. Then you have neglect, which includes emotional and physical neglect. The impact of having like somebody in your home with mental illness, depression, or any like suicidal person in the home. Addiction, so drug addicted or alcoholic family members, caregivers, and the impact, so like witnessing domestic violence against a caregiver, a loss of parent to death, abandonment or divorce, and incarceration of a family member. The CDC also expanded to include systemic issues. So looking at the big picture, how like environmental traumas impact folks. So systemic trauma, so like racism, systemic oppression, microaggressions, stereotype threats. You have poverty, so multi-generational trauma and lack of resources. Violence, exposure to community violence, and LGBTQ plus and BIPOC folks are especially at risk for violence. And discipline, so having those overly punitive school discipline, which contributes to the school to prison pipeline. And just so you know, like on average, folks are experiencing like about 3 to 4 ACEs like typically, but LGBTQ folks are 2 times likely to experience ACEs. So their rates are higher already. So let's look at types of trauma. So some of these you probably have heard of, but I'm going to expand a little bit further. So acute trauma is type 1. So this is like an individual exposed to a single event, which is an overwhelming traumatic event, such as death of a parent during one's childhood. According to Tara, chief characteristics of acute trauma include detailed memories relating to the traumatic event, an exaggerated startle response, hypervigilance, emotional reaction, overreactions, and misperceptions. So you'll see a lot of these reactions look like PTSD. It's important to know also that like not everybody who experiences the traumatic event is actually going to experience PTSD. So that kind of looks at like what protective factors did they have in place when they experienced that traumatic event. That will make a huge difference. And then you have complex trauma. So this is type 2 trauma. This results from protracted exposure to traumatizing situations and events such as years of emotional abuse by one's parents during childhood. So this is kind of looking at those ACEs. According to Tara, chief characteristics of complex trauma include dissociation, psychological numbing, rage, social withdrawal, and a sense of foreshortened future. So all these can be symptoms of PTSD as well. I know why you're not going. Okay, there you go. And then you have crossover trauma, which is type 3 trauma. So it's like acute trauma. Crossover trauma also results from a single overwhelming event. However, in the case of crossover trauma, the traumatic event is so devastating that the adverse psychological effects of the trauma are long-term. An example of this kind of trauma is being involved in a car accident in which other family members are killed. So chief characteristics of crossover trauma include extended mourning, depression, chronic pain, sleep disturbances such as insomnia and nightmares, difficulty concentrating, and irritability. So you see a lot of more like somatic stuff here too. So you got those 3 types. Some of the effects of complex trauma. So complex trauma is something like, you know, it happens over time. It's not just like a single event. This is something that is a buildup toward in someone's life. So complex trauma describes both children's exposure to multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature and wide-ranging long-term effects of this exposure. So these events are severe and pervasive, such as abuse or profound neglect. They usually occur early in life and can disrupt many aspects of a child's development and the formation of a sense of self. So that's really important to think about here, is like, how does this disrupt the child's development, like cognitively, but also how are they developing their sense of self, which is something that we're going to emphasize a lot in this presentation. Since these events often occur with a caregiver, they interfere with a child's ability to form secure attachment. That's also a really big thing, because the caregiver is normally supposed to be a source of that preventative factor, like the, sorry, not preventative factor. I'm blanking on the word right now, so I'm going to skip over that. Many aspects of a child's healthy physical and mental development rely on protective factors, what I was thinking. Many aspects of a child's healthy physical and mental development rely on this primary source of safety and stability. So really thinking about, like, if those traumatic things are happening in someone's child, like household, they're not getting that protective factor that they need in order to build that resilience towards that trauma. So more specifically, looking at the types of trauma that LGBTQ folks experience. We've talked a lot about these in the presentations beforehand, but I know a lot of you all are here for the first time, so we're definitely going to be covering those. But homophobia and transphobia, right? These create those hostile environments in all public settings, in schools, in homes, like institutions, doctors' offices, mental health institutions as well. Transgender and non-binary folks experiencing high levels of peer and adult physical violence to correct or censor gender non-conforming behaviors. So thinking about, like, are people able to use the restrooms in alignment with their gender? Are they able to use locker rooms? Are they able to use any kind of basic, even if you think about people going into mental health, residential homes and things like that, there isn't always a space for trans and non-binary folks. So that often get pushed into for example, if someone's assigned female at birth, but they're a trans male, they might get pushed into rooming with males, but they might not feel comfortable, which can also add to that traumatic experience. You have intersectional identities, so race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, being a sexual minority, etc., creates additional forms of oppression and discrimination. We know that they have higher levels of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. We know that they're also disproportionately impacted by homelessness and the trauma that comes with being unhoused. And also, of course, rejection from family of origin. There's hate crimes and incidents that we always hear about on the news. Well, we don't always hear about it, that's a lie, because it's definitely underreported. You have verbal, physical, and sexual assaults. Intimate partner violence is also as much happening in the LGBTQ plus community as it does in the heterosexual community. So it's usually about 1 in 3 folks are a victim of intimate partner violence. Discrimination in housing, social care, and healthcare. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of there's a huge lack of affirmative care when it comes to LGBTQ plus population. If you even think about the forms that people sign, a lot of times they only have male and female. They don't have other things like that. So, and then they don't have an option for you have to use dead names a lot of times. So that could be a traumatic experience in and of itself. Rejection from their home life, friends, family, coworkers, etc. So feeling that discrimination in the workplace is huge. And of course, due to prejudices, many people delay or never come out, which is also can be very traumatic, having to hide that part of yourself and all that internalized homophobia or transphobia. You have lesbians and bisexual women report high levels of sexual abuse by others who are trying to fix their sexual orientation. This is referred to as corrective rape or curative rape. And then you also have reparative therapy, which is conversion therapy. This in and of itself already induces a lot of trauma. This can include shock therapy, isolation from others, and withholding affection. So that's definitely I'm sure there's tons of more traumas that LGBTQ folks experience, but this is in a nutshell, some of the more obvious ones that we hear about. So how does this affect the LGBTQ body? And by that, I mean, like, how does all this trauma affect how an LGBTQ person is able to live in their body, or how does it affect their ability to come out or be their true self? So trauma responses can be physiological, psychological, emotional, and spiritual in nature. So if we look at this physiological sense, you do see a lot of hyperarousal when it comes like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This can include dilated pupils, muscle contraction. A lot of folks talk about being really tense, increased heart rate, blood pressure, etc. So what are you noticing like on a health basis? And then you have psychological. So constantly being in that fight, flight, or freeze. So that fight or flight freeze or fight or flight stance is, you're constantly in that stress hormone. This triggers that release of cortisol and the hormones dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. A common psychological response to trauma is known as dissociation. You'll see this a lot, that manifests as a perceived emotional and mental detachment from a significant traumatic event. A lot of people, especially working with folks who've gone through a lot of trauma in therapy, have blocks of time where they just don't remember details of their life. This is called like dissociative amnesia. This is a protective factor to help them like not have to relive those traumas. These reactions to stress or trauma are necessary and vital to the survival of human beings in dangerous situations. However, prolonged states of hyperarousal can lead to problematic physiological manifestations of trauma. So in the long term, this can lead to impacts on that neurodevelopment. And then of course, repeated exposure to traumatic events can lead to persistent and lifelong maladaptive coping mechanisms with specific impairments related to one's control of one's cognitive processing, reasoning skills, and problem solving. So maladaptive coping skills, we'll talk about that a little bit too. So of course, we talked about ACEs again. Sexual minority folks have higher rates of childhood sexual assaults, childhood physical assaults, and emotional maltreatment when compared to their heterosexual peers. It's also important to understand the impact of trauma within a historical context of an individual's life. So how has trauma left its mark? Do you notice how maybe a parent was traumatized and then passes it down to their child? And it can go from generation to generation. Traumatic experiences from earlier in life impact reactions and behaviors and influence the way the individual manages newer or recent traumatic experiences. So is that person, like, it's kind of one of those things where, like, let's say you got in a car accident, you're going to be avoidant of that car accident, or like, you're going to be avoidant of getting into a car because you're going to have that same like traumatic experience. But then the avoidance of those traumatic experiences then exacerbates the effect of it. So the psychological response or perception of traumatic experiences impact the physics. Did I already read that? No, physiological responses. Both of these defense mechanisms contribute to how trauma manifests. So how a person makes meaning or processes a personalized traumatic experience is very important here and can determine long-term traumatic responses. So are they personalizing it? Are they blaming themselves? Especially when it comes to like sexual assault, like there's a lot of like pushback on like people like not reporting because they don't get believed and things like that. And if you're constantly being told like you're just making it up or you ask for it and things like that, that's going to really have a big impact on how they personalize that traumatic event. LGBTQ folks experience prolonged and significant trauma as it often originates in childhood into adulthood, and it's experienced in all aspects of their lives, including homes, schools, employment, faith communities, etc. I'm talking a lot. I'm talking fast. So the incidence and prevalence, we know that there's like a huge underreporting of LGBTQ plus discrimination. I will also say that this is because, sometimes we don't even realize that we're being discriminated against, or because we live in a heterosexual and cisnormative world. So a lot of times we don't realize that things that are being imposed on us and things like that are actually forms of discrimination. And then of course, uncertainty of knowing about whether police investigators, advocates, or other systems of care will be supportive and affirming. This is a big thing, especially for LGBTQ folks calling the police. If you think about it I'll use the example of like domestic violence. A lot of times, like they might call the police and it's like, it's usually stereotyped that the male is the abuser, But like in that situation, it's like, who would be the abuser? And it's harder to like know, like, are they going to take us seriously? Is this going to be a safe environment? Is the police officer like going to be trauma informed? Are they going to treat us with respect, kind of thing? So calling the police in and of itself can already be like a big risk factor. And for some, it can also increase their trauma and risk by revealing their sexual orientation or gender identity. So maybe they're not out to their family or their friends or things like that. So you have multi-level trauma against the LGBTQ folks. So this is, we'll talk about direct trauma. So direct trauma is experienced directly by the individual. Trauma experienced based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. So this could be in the form of a microaggression. This could be in the form of like just flat out being rejected for a job, things like that. Indirect trauma is when you hear about or witness another person's traumatic experience. So examples include hearing someone else's trauma experience from peers, support groups, or in the news, such as hate crimes, systemic traumas enacted upon the LGBTQ individuals. I will say that like it's one of those things where like I remember the Pulse shooting, that definitely was a form of indirect trauma that really shook a bunch of people. I know myself included, like I felt really unsafe going to spaces and things like that because I didn't know when we would be the target of it. Then you have insidious trauma. So this encompasses an oppressive cultural narrative, such as experienced by the LGBTQ plus population in a homophobic or transphobic society. So this relates to those heterosexist and cisgenderist influences of society. So it's like a collective mindset that folks have, and they like push that onto the LGBTQ plus community. So it's systemic marginalization and oppression of these individuals, creating that othering experience, which is also creating that source of trauma. And then, of course, you have ongoing re-traumatization due to homophobic and transphobic societal views. And then, of course, you have microaggression. So if you think of it in like, either you're directly impacted, you're directly experiencing it, you're hearing about others, or it's just like the collective experience of like how society views this population and how they treat them. So how does this affect identity development? This is a big one. So if you're thinking about the buildup of all of this trauma and all of these experiences, of course, it's going to have an impact on identity development. So one, sense of self. This includes your self-concept, your self-worth, your self-esteem, all of those different things. So sexual trauma has been thought to cause an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. I feel like I hear this a lot. Ray, I have you unmuted. I don't know if you're.
Oh, I'm sorry. Could you mute me, please?
It's for some reason it's not allowing me to. Let me see if I can figure this out. Here we go. I got it. Yes. Thank you for that. Okay, so this is definitely a big stereotype. I have heard this all of my life, that somebody who has experienced childhood sexual abuse is then comes out later in life. People tend to think of that as like the origin story, and that is so false. Because I mean, we see on average how many times people experience ACEs. Physical trauma can cause fear of developing identities due to the association between violent experience and self-identity, and can prevent people from fully developing their identity or not coming out. So if you think about this, like maybe somebody was physically abused because of the way that they presented their gender identity, or physically abused because they presented as LGBTQ, or like you see a lot like little boys playing with dolls. It's something that could be like, you know, disturbing for parents. So then they might do some kind of like physical trauma or physical harm to try and like shake it out of their child or something like that. But if you think about that being a factor, like maybe it might make somebody hesitate to come out later on in life for fear that that might happen again. The sense of self is impacted by insidious trauma due to the overarching message that their sexual orientation and gender identity is wrong. So this is the part that leads into that internalized homophobia and transphobia, which often can lead to suicide to escape the traumatic experience that it encompasses coming out. So if you think about this too, it's like if you can't ever escape a world that is homophobic and transphobic, what other way can you escape, right? So some people do this out of desperation. Some people do it to stop the pain. Obviously, we don't know all the answers to why people do complete suicide, but you think about how if you're not feeling that sense of support in your home, in your friend community, at work, in the medical field, in the mental health field, like if you're not feeling any of this, you're going to feel like, okay, well, like that's a hard world to live in. So it makes sense why some folks might have like really low self-esteem, or sorry, low levels of mental health. Some individuals prolong disclosing their traumatic experiences for fear that it will be associated with their sexual orientation or gender identity, like we talked about earlier. And there is no proof or research that proves that connection of abuse leading to sexual orientation and gender identity. So I continued, obviously. So the fear of disclosing traumatic events, and the longer one takes to address their abuse history in a therapeutic environment, the longer the detrimental effects can make an impact on their overall well-being and functioning. So when you think about this, diagnoses such as borderline personality disorder come out from this. So someone with borderline personality disorder often has a
Sorry.
It's okay. Often has had complex trauma in their life. So they often have PTSD, and they like sometimes, I don't know why, but they sometimes have like bipolar disorder as well. But with borderline personality disorder, it's a buildup of all these different traumatic events that have happened in their life, and it comes out as like a form of like defense mechanism. But this is also because like maybe they haven't ever like addressed all of the trauma that's gone in their life, so it forms into like a personality disorder. And I say this because, you know, like there's a loss of sense of self. There's a difficulty trusting people, so there might be some manipulation in there of like lying and trying to like manipulate a situation so that people don't actually know how you're feeling. It's a lot of like lack of trust in other people, which makes sense if you're experiencing that complex trauma growing up. So due to the nature of coming out, individuals might lose support systems, further impacting their ability to cope with traumatic experiences, as they do not have the proper protective factors to reinforce safety. Not disclosing or addressing traumatic experiences leads to higher and prolonged sense of shame, marginalization, and isolation due to the heterosexist and cisgender norms within society. This is like pretty common. It's like really common for folks to like not ever disclose anything traumatic, or just kind of like suppress it because of, you know, like especially with working with youth, they might suppress these things because they don't want to get their parents in trouble, or they just know like, you know, it's just like hard for someone to talk about that, or they might not even know that the abuse that they endured is actually abuse, and that's not okay because they were groomed by their abusers to think that it's not anything wrong. A lot of folks groom them to think that that's actually what love looks like. Then you have gender nonconforming folks often hiding or denying their gender identity for fear of repercussions and community violence contributing to their internalized transphobia. So this is also, internalized transphobia is definitely something that I see a lot within this work, and how feeling like, you know, you're a lot of people say like being born in the wrong body, but also like, for example, like I've heard somebody say that, you know, wishing that it wasn't them, like why did it have to be them that was born in the wrong body, or like why does it have to be them who, you know, like you get what I'm saying. But it's like that in and of itself, and then a lot of parents might not let them go on hormone replacement therapy to be more in alignment with their gender. So having to suppress that part of their identity is also very traumatic as well. So coping with trauma. So we know that there's higher rates of suicide and attempts in the LGBTQ plus community. But they can do like positive ways of coping include involvement in therapy, obviously, support groups, not on here, but like medication support can be helpful as well. Having a school environment that's safe. So for youth, do they have a Gender and Sexualities Alliance Club? What kind of resources do they have at college campuses for LGBTQ plus folks? Your work environment, is your work environment inclusive? Do they have something, is there forms and things that are gender neutral? Are they using gender neutral language? I am actually not sharing the slides, but I can share the recording with you. I will be sharing the recording with everyone here. Yes, thank you. So negative ways of coping include, so these are those maladaptive coping skills. Oh, sorry, I just skipped ahead. So extracurricular activities, socializing, and creating things like art and things like forms of art and stuff like that, etc. Negative ways of coping include substance use, which is really high in the LGBTQ+ community. Engaging in risky behaviors. So this could be like promiscuity, this could be like excessive spending, gambling, eating disorders, things like that. Isolation, self-harming, and suicidal ideation. We know that for folks, like suffering in silence can be a really like negative way of coping with things, because if you don't process your thoughts or feelings and things like that, it just you get more and more into those cognitive distortions, and your mind can go anywhere, really. So always encouraging people to talk about it. With suicide prevention and things like that, it is really hard to work with somebody, especially when they're suicidal, and especially when you're a family member, because that's the last thing they want to do is talk about it with people. But highly encourage it, not in like a pushy kind of way, but always just letting people know like you're there for them if they need to talk to somebody. A lot of people don't like reach out to people. I always think about this one thing that I saw one time about like how, when it comes to like a physical injury, like let's say someone got into a car accident, people oftentimes like give them cards, get well soon, things like that. They'll visit them, give them attention, be there for them essentially. But when it comes to suicide, it's like they don't know what to do, and people don't check up on them, because I don't know if it's because like it's a hard thing to feel or manage, but we should be treating it in the same way. We should be telling people like get well soon. We should be telling people like, hey, it's going to get better, and checking in on them. LGBTQ survivors of trauma can benefit from embracing their sexual orientation and or gender identity rather than avoiding it. Rivera 2002 noted that LGB youth who experienced peer victimization and had PTSD symptoms were more accepting of their sexual orientation. This may be explained by the victimization forcing them towards greater self-awareness and self-acceptance. So thinking about like, okay, getting bullied and things like that, but being bullied because you were out also, like, I don't know, like sometimes like this is kind of like my experience as well. In high school, I came out at a young age, and there were people who said comments to me, but it also kind of made me a little bit more resilient, because I knew that I had the ability to be safe in my community, and I had my community, like my chosen family, who defended me and backed me up. I do feel like that's part of the reason why I'm very prideful in who I am. But it can go either way for people. One study found that transgender folks were able to cope with the after effects of trauma due to the resilience developed by pride in both their racial and gender identity. And then, of course, the importance of social support. Social support provides stimulation of emotional coping, resources like mental health services, and feeling of community and support. Even like just a social group of any sort with other LGBTQ folks can be so extremely helpful and important for people to know that like, hey, I'm also going through the same thing, but we have each other here. When social support is limited, it negatively in fact it influences an individual's ability to cope, because you're never talking to anybody about it. You're not feeling validated. You're not being told that like, hey, this is a normal experience. Well, it's an abnormal experience to like, well, wait, sorry. It's an abnormal experience. The transphobia, homophobia is an abnormal experience, but our feelings are the normal experience. That's what I was trying to say. Cool. And so importance of social support, we always emphasize chosen family. So if you haven't heard the term chosen family, it means that like a lot of LGBTQ folks often lean on their chosen families. So this can look like friends, it can look like siblings, cousins, things like that. They can still be related to you, but essentially they're your chosen family because they are the ones that support you through your coming out process, or just are there for you emotionally when your like family of origin has like rejected you. So chosen family is definitely a big thing. Sometimes it like clicks with the left arrow. Okay. So moving on to like trauma-informed practices and what does that look like? So SAMHSA outlined it very beautifully. I'm just gonna borrow from them. One is recognizing the impact of violence and victimization on an individual's development and coping strategies. So really understanding those adverse childhood experiences, understanding how child abuse can affect somebody's development and cognitive functioning. Talking about all the different levels of trauma like we just talked about. So coming at it from that understanding and coming at it from like how an LGBTQ plus person is gonna carry all of that on their back. Center recovery from trauma as a primary goal of intervention. Utilizing an empowerment model or approach in work with people who have been disempowered by traumatic exposure. So a lot of like the reason why an empowerment model is so effective in this treatment is because when you're experiencing a traumatic event, it's like a loss of power and control if you think about it. Like you lose that sense of autonomy. You've now been like victimized by this traumatic event, so it makes you feel like you can't like do things on your own, or you feel like you can't get past that trauma and things like that. So empowerment model is building people up and letting them know like, hey, you can get through this and you can do it on your own too, but you can also do it with support and things like that. So really building those people's self-esteem and self-worth up through an empowerment model. Prioritizing client choice, voice, and control. This one's huge. So you really want to have a collaborative effort when it comes to trauma-informed practices. You want to make sure that you are meeting the client where they're at. So what might be, so like you have trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Obviously it's an evidence-based practice, but evidence-based practices tend to really be designed for like white cis heterosexual people. So they're a lot more effective in certain populations, but really you need to look at it from like an intersectional or like trauma-informed approach, because what might work with some clients might not work with other clients, emphasizing the importance of having that client's voice and that collaborative effort and meeting the client where they're at, and not trying to fit them into this box of evidence-based practices and things like that. Ensuring practice efforts are firmly rooted in relational collaboration, and emphasizing the importance of creating safe, respectful, and trustworthy therapeutic environments and relationships in an effort to minimize the possibility of re-traumatization. So I always think about when I worked at this domestic violence shelter where when people came into our program, they had a list of things that they had to do. They had to take like parenting classes, they had to do financial wellness classes, and like all kinds of classes, when in reality, what they were really wanting was an escape from their traumatic experience, right? But being forced into doing all of these like different like criteria to be in the program is also re-traumatizing them, because they're now losing that sense of self, that sense of autonomy, and they're having to going back into this controlling environment that they were trying to leave. So having that trauma-informed approach is like offering the services, but not requiring it. So meeting the client where they're at. So more into trauma-informed practices. Obviously, it's necessary to have that trauma-informed approach with the LGBTQ plus population. As we talked about, they carry the load of oppressive, marginalized, and prejudiced forces against. Sorry, my voice is going. So we don't want, as I mentioned before, we don't want to continue causing harm for these individuals. They've already experienced a lot of traumatic experiences, and we're trying to help them get through this with like good trauma-informed mental health services. SAMHSA recommends that organizations and institutions incorporate knowledge of cultural, historical, and gender issues into practice, noting the importance of an organization that challenges stereotypes, attends to the power of language to bias and inclusion, values cultural strengths and resilience, and acknowledges the impact of historical trauma for oppressed and marginalized groups. So really looking at, if you're part of an organization or an institution, like what does the language look like that you use? Are there gender neutral bathrooms there? Even for a client coming into like mental health services, a classroom, just any kind of institution, if you have even just like a little rainbow symbol somewhere, or all they're welcome or something like that, it's automatically going to make somebody feel like already that much more welcomed. On a group level, recognizing the lack of trust towards privileged groups and oppressors, and discriminatory practices aimed at limiting freedom and denial of rights. So this is kind of one of those things, and I'm just going to use this example for simplicity, but maybe a BIPOC client might not feel comfortable with a white therapist because they might not think that they are culturally competent or like understanding like where they're at in life and things like that. So recognizing that there could be a lack of trust towards this group. On an individual level, recognizing historical structural oppression and resulting trauma which LGBTQ folks experience. So really recognizing, checking in on your own biases as well. And post-traumatic growth. So there is hope. Just because someone has gone through something traumatic does not mean that they can grow from it, or does not mean that they can't grow from it. So resilience, right? How do people build resilience? Resilience is the ability to rebound after a challenge or difficulty, and has the ability to withstand stress through internal and external resources and attributes. So this is where the protective factors come in, right? So if someone has a protective factor at the time of a traumatic incident, they might be less likely to develop PTSD. Using that strength-based approach to foster resilience in internal and external protective factors. So really highlighting like what are some positive qualities that somebody has, like in my therapeutic practice, talking about like how, you went through some really bad things and how did you get through it? Like you're here, right? Finding meaning making in the traumatic experiences. So this happened, but what came out of it? Like, did anything positive come out of it? Did you meet somebody in a mental health facility that you are now best friends with? Things like that. There could always be positive experiences that come out of traumatic experiences, which sounds a little bit backwards, but it is definitely possible. Improvement in personal coping strategies based on lessons learned from traumatic exposure. So really thinking about like, okay, prior to this traumatic incident, I didn't really have positive coping skills, but because that happened, I had to learn to cope with certain things, or maybe like certain thoughts that we might have, or just experiences and things like that. Finding personal inner strength. So believing in yourself, knowing that you got through something really traumatic and it has not impacted your ability to maybe get an education or things like that, or like make friends who are actually really great people in your life. Finding a deeper sense of purpose or meaning to life. There's a lot of people who've gone through traumatic events that later on in life decide to give back to that community of people who have gone through similar things. And it gives them a lot of meaning to be able to give back because they have this understanding of like what that person went through. Arriving at clear goals and priorities for one's life. Maybe because you went through something, you now realize like this isn't the trajectory I want in life, and maybe I want to go a different direction or something. Gratitude and appreciation for life, relationship improvements, and enhanced motivation to give back to others, as we talked about already. So these measures serve as protective factors for re-traumatization. So really, if you emphasize like this could be a very or if you emphasize having these types of things, it might also make it so that you don't continue to feel trauma from that experience. It can help you heal from those traumas, but it can also help you not go back, like run into some of those kinds of traumas again. So recovery from trauma and building resilience. We're almost done here, everybody. So healing is highly subjective and non-linear. This is super duper important because especially from a therapeutic stance, like a lot of people will come to therapy and they'll have really good weeks, and then all of a sudden they have a really low week, and then they feel like all of their healing that they did is now somehow erased. And it's really important to note that like your healing journey does look a lot like this. And sometimes you might be on a high for a while, but it does not mean that just because you have one bad day or one bad week or one bad month, it does not mean that all of that healing is all of a sudden gone. Finding coping skills to help when you're feeling overwhelmed by the sensations and emotions associated with the past. So really recognizing somatically, how are you feeling? Am I having a stomach ache? Why am I having a stomach ache? Am I being triggered by something? What can I do when I'm feeling triggered? Can I go on a mindful walk? Can I do a guided meditation? Things like that. Consistent yoga practice has been shown to decrease levels of PTSD. Learning how to breathe calmly and remaining in a state of relative physical relaxation, even while accessing painful and horrifying memories, is an essential tool for recovery. So when we do this in a therapeutic environment, we want to make sure that before we even try jumping into somebody's trauma, that we know that they have coping skills to self-regulate and self-soothe. You don't ever really want to talk about someone's trauma with them if they don't already know how to have those kind of coping skills, or if you are able to provide some kind of support for them. Just making sure that somebody has like the tools they need before jumping into some of that trauma. Self-awareness of different emotions, body awareness, or different feelings such as anxiety, annoyance, nervousness, etc. Mindfulness and being in tune and aware of mind and body. So these are definitely things that can help you really move forward from the traumatic experience that you've had. Yes, and always make sure that you're working with a therapist who's trained in working with trauma, because that's definitely a thing, and make sure that you ask them like what's their experience. Because some, unfortunately, some therapists don't really care about that, and they'll take on a client and they might do more harm than good. So making sure that your therapist is trauma informed and has some kind of traumatic experience training. Let's see. Naps. I love it. Recovery. Okay, so it's continued. Practicing mindfulness. So this is the last slide, I promise. Practicing mindfulness calms down the sympathetic nervous system, so you are less likely to be thrown into fight or flight. So practicing mindfulness is really important. You see a lot of it in like dialectical behavioral therapy, which is something that is used very commonly for borderline personality disorder, because a lot of times we can get taken out of our present state and into these like very cognitive distorted thoughts. So really making sure like you can stay in the present, reminding yourself that you are in a safe place, you're not back in that traumatic experience, and that you can kind of be here and be present. Relationships and a good support network is the most powerful protection against being re-traumatized. This can include social support, loved ones, and chosen family. Once again, finding professional therapy that specializes in trauma-informed approaches. Physical touch is a tricky one. Physical touch, I would definitely always suggest checking in with somebody before you assume that they might want a hug or a touch or even being rocked, especially when somebody has been through something traumatic. A lot of times physical touch can be something that's very, very triggering. So just checking in and just being like, hey, are you okay with touch? Do you want a hug? How can I help support you right now? And yeah, so lastly, taking action. So stress hormones are secreted during traumatic situations. They're meant to give us strength and endurance to respond to extraordinary conditions. Actively doing something to deal with the stress, like helping others, can help reduce the symptoms of trauma. So there's a really good book out there called Burnout by Emily and Amelia Nagoski, and they talk about the stress cycle and how a lot of times our body doesn't know when to turn off the stress hormone. So what you can do when you're trying to manage your stress is like do something to complete that stress cycle. So they give the example of like you're running in a forest and you have a bear chasing you. And let's say you outrun the bear. Does your body automatically know that you're not in that fight or flight anymore? No, it doesn't. So you need to do something to like signal to your body, whether it's like jumping jacks or like taking a walk outside. For me, I use like Palo Santo. I don't know if anyone knows what that is, but it's I'll light it up and then I'll do some deep breathing to signal to my body, okay, you don't have to be stressed out from the day anymore. I recommend doing this also for like work stuff, but like just letting my body know like I don't have to be stressed out anymore. And then lastly, just some resources for you all. So the LGBTQ Center OC, we are therapists who are trained in trauma. So you can definitely come to us for services that are going to be LGBTQ affirming. Private practices, therapists specializing in TFCBT, so that trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and LGBTQ affirming therapy. Obviously, checking with your insurance provider to get linked to a therapist. Some other organizations you might want to check out, like NAMI Orange County has like support groups and things like that that you can join. Mental Health Association of Orange County, often called MHA. Be Well OC, Orange County Behavioral Health, Pathways of California, and Pacific Clinics, just to name a few. There's a lot of different mental health agencies out there. But yeah, that is what I got for y'all today. So I apologize if this is very dense. There's not really any way to like sugarcoat trauma. And it's a lot of different information, but I hope this was really helpful for you all. I have about 5 minutes left if anyone has any questions that they want to ask. Hopefully I can answer some, but I'm also going to drop this link here, which is the post survey for the presentation. So if you are interested in getting that compensation, but also providing feedback is definitely helpful. But yeah, thank you so much. That is trauma, recovery, and resilience within the LGBTQ+ community. Thank you, Mary. So I will kick back in case anyone has any questions. And I'm going to stop my recording actually.